They say kings are buried with gold, but she buried her crown beside a cradle, a small coffin, no larger than a bread box, draped in white silk, lowered into the earth while the wind howled through the royal chapel. No music, no eulogy. Only a mother, still, silent, her face drained of color, her hands clutching a lace bonnet too small for memory. This was not her first burial, nor would it be her last. Her name was Augusta of Saxe-Gotha, a foreign princess, a royal consort, a queen without a throne. But more than that, she was a mother who buried more children than she ever held for long. While others wrote history in blood and war, Augusta's tale was etched in lullabies that faded too soon, in footprints that never reached adulthood, and in the hollow hush of nurseries that forgot how to echo with laughter. This is not a tale of war or scandal or thrones won by ambition. This is the slow unraveling of a woman stitched into duty, corseted in sorrow, and embalmed in silence. Tonight, we walk through the corridors of grief. We follow her, not to a coronation, but to a grave. Not one grave, but many. And behind each one, a heartbeat that once called her mother. She was 16, too young to understand what it meant to belong to another country, too well raised to say no. Augusta of Saxe-Gotha, born into the minor nobility of a splintered Germany, was a girl raised among books and stiff manners. Her home in Gotha had taught her Latin prayers, needlework, and how to sit through long Lutheran sermons without blinking. But it had not prepared her for England, nor for marriage, nor for what the court would call duty. She stepped onto English soil in 1736 with a dowry in her trunks and a royal name in her mouth. The Prince of Wales, Frederick, son of King George II. He would be her husband, whether she liked him or not, whether she knew him or not, whether he wanted her or not. The wedding took place days after she arrived. The words were in English. She barely understood them, but she smiled. That was her role now, to smile, to obey, and to produce heirs. From the moment she crossed the palace threshold, Augusta was treated like furniture, elegant, foreign, expensive, and ultimately silent. Her accent marked her as other. Her modest Lutheran upbringing was considered quaint. Her manners, too stiff. Her eyes, too serious. She was German in all the ways the English resented and none of the ways they respected. The prince, her new husband, was not cruel. But neither was he kind. He was preoccupied with gambling, mistresses, politics, and appearances. He took one look at Augusta and saw not a companion, but a vessel, a womb dressed in brocade. He paraded her at balls and dinners, praised her posture, complimented her gowns. But when the music stopped and the guests left, he went elsewhere, to other chambers, other warmth. Augusta remained in their shared palace like a letter unopened, addressed but unread. She spent her first winter in England not in love, but in translation. She learned English through nursery rhymes and medical texts, because childbirth would come before conversation. She wrote long letters home in German, folded them neatly, and watched them leave her hand like paper boats on dark water. She waited for replies that rarely came. There was no one to talk to. The court ladies were polite but suspicious. The servants stared when they thought she couldn't see. Her confessor spoke broken German. Her husband spoke in riddles. Even the walls seemed to whisper in a tongue that didn't want her. She found solace in her garden, a narrow strip of earth behind the palace where nothing bloomed the way it had back home. Still, she would kneel in the cold soil, digging with gloved hands, as if hoping to uncover a root that might remember her name. Sometimes she played music, quietly, alone. The clavichord became her only friend, a wooden throat through which she could sing without speaking. She had no voice at court, but she had fingers, and they wept for her. And then she became pregnant. The court rejoiced. The prince smiled for once. The king sent gifts. The people cheered. The German girl was doing her job. But Augusta was terrified. She didn't know what it meant to give birth in a palace. She didn't know that her pain would be public, that her body would no longer be hers, that she would lie in silk sheets screaming while strangers judged her strength through painted fans. She prayed every night, not for herself, but for the child. Let it live. Let it be healthy. Let it know love. In May 1737, she gave birth to her first son. They named him George. He would someday be king. The nation celebrated. The court declared victory. But Augusta, in her chamber, lay pale and quiet. Because in that moment, she knew. Her life was no longer hers. Her body was not a temple. It was a factory, a battlefield, a cradle and a coffin. No one asked her how she felt. No one cared. She looked at the child they placed in her arms and smiled. Not because she was happy, but because she was afraid not to be. She sang to him in German, a lullaby her mother once sang to her. The nursemaid raised an eyebrow. "It sounds like mourning." Augusta didn't answer. The days passed. More pregnancies came, one after another. The palace became a carousel of christenings and recoveries. But Augusta never recovered. Not fully, not inside. Each time she bled, she wondered, will this one stay? Each time she held a newborn, she feared, will this one die? And yet, no one saw her unravel. Because unraveling slowly doesn't make a sound. To the world, she was doing well, a success, a queen in the making, but inside, the girl from Gotha was still there, still waiting for a letter, still singing to soil, still digging for something that felt like home. And the corridors of the English palace grew longer, colder, and more unfamiliar, even as her children began to fill them. Because Augusta had learned something dangerous. You can give the world everything it asks for, and still have no one ask how much it cost you. They crowned her with expectations, not jewels. After giving birth to her first son, Augusta was no longer just the foreign princess. She was the mother of an heir. And with that came applause. Applause that echoed not from love, but from relief. The queen consort had done her job, and in that moment, her body ceased to belong to her. It became a state asset, a royal estate for the planting of dynasties. What followed was not celebration, it was obligation. Another pregnancy, then another, and another. 9 children in total, 9 journeys through blood and bone, 9 days of joy, each punctuated by years of fear. Augusta was not a warm mother. That's what the courtiers said. They called her distant, detached, too formal, too Protestant, too German. But what they couldn't see, or chose not to, was that she didn't fear motherhood. She feared love. Because every time she loved, she risked losing. And she had learned early, painfully, that in her world, children were not hers to keep. They belonged to the nation, to the throne, to fate. She watched her sons and daughters handed off to governesses, to tutors, to ceremonial duties before they could speak in full sentences. She wasn't allowed to hold them too long. It was improper. They might become soft. She learned to kiss their foreheads when no one looked, to slip letters under nursery doors, to hum lullabies behind closed lips, careful not to draw attention. The palace halls echoed with marble coldness. No cradle was ever left unattended, but none were truly held. Each child was wrapped in silk, but not warmth. The nursery, for all its gold and embroidery, was a gilded greenhouse where children grew fast, hard, and alone. Augusta stood beside them, but never inside. Even with her own blood, there were boundaries, unspoken, uncrossable. Her husband, Frederick, encouraged it. To him, a child was a chess piece, and motherhood was a ceremonial role. "I married you for heirs," he once said bluntly, "not for tears." He paraded the children at public events like trophies. He refused to let Augusta choose their nurses or their education. He even demanded that she not be present during certain lessons. Her influence, he warned, might be too soft. Too soft, too maternal, too human. Augusta learned to fold herself smaller, not just in posture, but in presence. She smiled at parades. She nodded through court meetings. She wore pearls that felt like shackles. Her hands, once used for playing music, now trembled as she poured tea, careful not to spill, not to show weakness. But the pressure, like heat beneath porcelain, created hairline cracks. She kept a journal, a private one, separate from court documents. In it, she wrote not of politics, but of moments. "George coughed last night. I stayed outside his room until dawn. The doctor says it is nothing. I do not believe him. I've dreamed of coffins again. My daughter smiled today. Only 5 teeth. It broke something in me. I feared she might never smile again. I must learn to let them go. But what is a mother who does not hold?" These entries were not meant to be read. They were whispers to herself, echoes of a voice buried beneath protocol. Because Augusta was living in a palace where love had to be calculated, not shown. Affection was not forbidden, but it was always watched. And like a candle in a cathedral, it had to flicker quietly, lest it draw too much notice. Some nights, she would sit alone, holding a blanket her child had outgrown, smelling it as if to catch a fragment of warmth. Other nights, she prayed. Not to God, he had become too distant, but to the walls. The same walls that had heard her scream through childbirth, the same walls that had watched her children leave, one by one, to be raised by others. The same walls that would, one day, close in on her completely. And yet, she endured. Not out of strength, but out of routine. Because pain, when worn long enough, becomes clothing. And Augusta had become a woman dressed in invisible mourning, years before death even came. No one noticed the change. That's how slow it was. But it showed in her voice, a tone more measured, more reserved. In her letters, shorter, less personal. In her eyes, once bright, now quietly extinguished. She was not yet broken. But the cracking had begun, and no one cared. After all, the line of succession was secured. The heir was growing. The dynasty had roots. What more could they want from her? What more could she give? But the truth is, Augusta still had so much to lose, because the palace never took everything at once. It took joy in pieces. One child sick, another falls from favor. One dies. Two survive but grow cold. One no longer recognizes her voice. And suddenly, the woman who had birthed 9 children is left feeling like a stranger in her own nursery, like a statue in a garden that no longer blooms. It was a morning like any other. The sun filtered through the tall palace windows in thin, indifferent rays. Birdsong echoed across the garden, too distant to feel real. In the nursery, the servants moved with practiced efficiency, lighting fires, airing linens, preparing baths. But one crib was quieter than the rest. Too quiet. When the nurse reached in to lift the infant, she paused. The child was cold, stiff, motionless. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was final. Augusta had just entered the corridor when she heard the muffled sound. Not a scream, but a startled gasp. A sound that says, something is wrong, but no one dares say it aloud. She didn't run. Running was improper. She walked, fast, silent, contained. And then she saw. The white blanket was still neatly tucked around the baby. His eyes were closed, his lips slightly parted, as if still sleeping. But his skin had lost its color, his body, its softness. The room was full of people, yet no one moved. Time stopped, not out of reverence, but out of confusion. Because how could a royal baby just die? There had been no warning, no fever, no injury. One moment he was cooing, the next, a husk in embroidered linen. They later called it crib death. A mystery, a fluke, a tragedy with no one to blame. But grief doesn't care for medical terms. It doesn't listen to reason. Augusta stood by the cradle and looked down at the son she would never raise. Not the heir, not the king-to-be, just a child, her child. And she realized something no court etiquette book had ever taught her. There are no instructions for how to mourn in public when you're not allowed to show it. She didn't cry. Not then, not there. She excused herself, hands trembling behind folded sleeves. She returned to her room. She closed the door, and she screamed into a pillow until her throat was raw. It was the only sound in a palace built to mute women like her. The court responded with efficiency. Black crepe was draped across the nursery doors. A funeral was arranged within hours. A tiny coffin ordered, barely larger than a drawer. Priests were summoned. Bells rang. But there were rules. No public display of emotion. No extended mourning. No change to scheduled royal appearances. The prince was unmoved. He patted Augusta's shoulder and said, "We must try again. These things happen. These things." As if a child were a broken plate, as if the womb could simply replace what was lost. That night, Augusta sat alone, holding the christening gown they had saved for the baby's 6-month portrait. Her fingers traced the tiny embroidered initials. And for the first time in her life, she didn't feel royal. She felt empty. A cracked teapot, porcelain smile on the outside, nothing but steam and sorrow within. She wasn't allowed to attend the burial. It was deemed unseemly. She was told, "You must rest. Let the servants handle it." But how does one rest when their child is being lowered into the earth? She lay in bed, eyes open, staring at the ceiling as if it held answers. In the days that followed, Condolences arrived from foreign courts. Polite, distant, templated. Her ladies-in-waiting avoided the subject. The nursery was cleaned, reset, repainted, as if the baby had never existed. Grief became her secret, a private wound stitched beneath velvet. She wore her mourning not in clothes, but in posture, a stiffness that no corset required. In her eyes, which no longer lingered on joy. In her touch, which became cautious, like someone afraid to break what she held. The palace, meanwhile, moved on. So did Frederick. He returned to his entertainments, his gatherings, his mistresses. To him, the dead child was unfortunate, but not important. "We'll have more," he said. "We must." But Augusta had already lost more than a child. She had lost trust in her husband, in the palace, in the safety of joy. She began avoiding the nursery. She would pause outside the door, fingers grazing the handle, and then walk away. She stopped singing. Even the clavichord fell silent, its keys untouched, dust collecting where music once lived. Her next pregnancy came soon, too soon. The court cheered. The prince beamed. But Augusta was no longer hopeful. She moved through the pregnancy like a condemned prisoner walking a familiar hallway, step by step, heartbeat by heartbeat, waiting for the next sentence. Because now, motherhood no longer meant joy. It meant risk. It meant loss. It meant watching another child grow only to wonder, how long do I have you? She began writing again, in secret. They said I was cold, but if they knew the fire it takes to keep a smile when your soul has gone to earth, I can no longer look at cribs without seeing coffins. I pray, not that they live forever, but that they outlive me. These were not the thoughts of a mad woman. They were the thoughts of a mother whose grief had been denied oxygen and so burned inward, quietly, like coals beneath snow. From the outside, Augusta remained unchanged, proper, poised, present. But inside, something had curled up and stopped breathing. And that silence, that haunting, echoing silence, would follow her for the rest of her life. Because no one prepares a queen for the sound of a crib that will never be filled again. The baby was gone, but the cradle remained. It stood in the corner of the nursery, polished, perfect, untouched, like a shrine no one dared to dismantle. Servants dusted around it. Nannies walked past it with lowered eyes. Even Augusta, when passing the door, would glance at it with something that wasn't quite grief anymore, but something far worse: expectation. Because in this palace, there was always another child to come, another name to be written, another body to be risked. Within weeks of the funeral, Augusta was pregnant again. It was not a choice. It was a requirement. The court needed an heir and a spare, and perhaps a dozen more after that. But Augusta was still bleeding, not visibly, not dramatically, but within. Her body was still hollow from the loss, still recovering from the tearing, the fever, the silent nights of cramping pain and blood-soaked sheets. Still haunted by the phantom weight of a child who would never cry again. She should have been allowed to rest, to breathe, to grieve. But queens don't grieve. They produce. Her stomach swelled again before her heart had even shrunk back to size. And this time the pain was different, sharper, less forgiving. Each kick from within felt less like life and more like punishment. Each month passed with dread. She stopped counting the days, stopped preparing the nursery, stopped sewing gowns, because hope had become a dangerous thing, a blade with a ribbon tied around it. By the 7th month, Augusta could barely walk without wincing. Her hair began to fall, not in clumps, but in long, fine strands that clung to her brushes like whispers. She bled more than she should. She grew pale, then gray. Doctors came and went with leeches and tonics and Latin phrases that sounded like rituals more than remedies. They called it female weakness. They prescribed stillness. They whispered about melancholy. But it wasn't melancholy. It was a body giving out under the weight of too many graves, too little rest, and no one willing to say, "She is not well." The walls knew. They had seen this before. Other royal women crushed quietly beneath the pressure of reproduction. But walls do not speak. Her bed became her world. Not the royal canopied bed of portraits and ceremonies, but a prison of linen and sweat. The curtains stayed drawn. The fire burned low. The air was thick with lavender and silence. She would wake at night and reach for a child who wasn't there. Would press a hand to her stomach and wonder, not if the child would live, but whether she would survive this one. The loneliness was total. Even her ladies-in-waiting grew cautious, afraid to ask how she felt, afraid to witness another unraveling. Frederick visited less and less. He had never been fond of sick rooms. "They reek of failure," he once said. And so, she labored again, in silence, without joy, without song. The child was born blue, but breathing. A girl. She lived. But Augusta did not rejoice. She simply stared, eyes wide, unblinking, as the midwife placed the baby in her arms. "She's healthy," they said. "A blessing," they said. But to Augusta, the child was not a blessing. She was a promise that death would return, that love would once again be asked and punished. She handed the baby to the nurse and rolled over, her back to the room. Outside, the palace resumed its routine. The court announced the birth with fanfare. The people toasted the princess. The nursery was repainted in soft pastels. New gowns were ordered. Portraits were arranged. But within Augusta's private chambers, time stood still. The cradle, once empty, now rocked again. But the room remained cold, uninviting, because warmth had become dangerous. It had betrayed her too many times. One by one, more children came, and one by one, the cradle would hold them, and then release them, to tutors, to illness, to expectation, to death. The nursery became a carousel, filled with movement but no joy. And Augusta became a silhouette, a mother in form, not in presence, a name on a birth certificate, a shadow at the edge of the portraits. They said she was recovering. They said she was resting. They said she was strong. But strength does not always roar. Sometimes it just lies still, hoping the ceiling doesn't collapse. The palace was filled with cradles, but fewer and fewer cries. Each silence was louder than the last, each loss heavier than the one before. And Augusta began to feel like a house herself, a grand, echoing thing once full of life, now standing with too many rooms closed off, too many windows shuttered, too many memories buried under polished floors. And still, she endured. Because queens must. Because mothers do. But the cost was steep, and it would only grow heavier. The cradle rocked again. This time, not by hand, but by memory. Augusta sat in the nursery one evening, alone. The fire reduced to its final embers, the air stale with lavender and dust. Her newest child, her fifth, had been moved to another room. The doctors insisted the child needed better air, brighter light, stricter care. She didn't protest, not out loud. But that night she remained seated, facing the cradle, listening. There was no child inside, just blankets, folded, still warm. But she heard it, a faint coo, a flutter of breath, the soft thud of a baby kicking in sleep. She rose, slowly, walked to the cradle, empty, of course. Yet in her mind the sound persisted, like an echo from a hallway no longer there. She told no one, because if she admitted it, they would say she was grieving too much, too long, too deeply. And that, in court, was a greater sin than sorrow. Augusta began to keep to herself. She declined social gatherings, skipped dinners, asked for her letters to be read aloud because she couldn't concentrate on the words. When spoken to, she often didn't reply, not because she didn't hear, but because she was somewhere else, far beyond the marble halls and embroidered chairs. She was in the nursery, always. Even when her body wasn't there, her mind had sunk its roots in that room, where time stopped and shadows breathed. Servants whispered that she was withdrawn. Ladies in waiting noticed how she stared into corners as if expecting someone. Sometimes she would call out a name, softly as if testing it on her tongue. George, Elizabeth, Alfred. Names that belonged to children both living and gone. But she never clarified which one she meant. She no longer trusted her own memory. Each child's face blurred, each voice overlapped, each laugh brief and borrowed from the last. At times, she would smile at a maid, thinking it was her daughter, or reach out to a footman, believing him her son. And when corrected, she would blink, apologize, then drift back into herself. The palace doctors called it female fragility. The clergy suggested more prayer. Frederick, her husband, rolled his eyes and asked for stronger wine. "She's always been like this," he said, melancholic. "The Germans are prone to it." No one intervened, because Augusta's illness didn't scream. It whispered, and whispers in a royal household are easily drowned by applause and protocol. One day, a guest arrived at court, a noblewoman with 3 children in tow. The halls filled with laughter again, tiny shoes clicking against marble, hands tugging at skirts, voices rising and falling in careless joy. Augusta emerged from her chamber for the first time in weeks. She saw the children and stopped mid-step. Her hands began to tremble. One of the girls, curly-haired, green-eyed, reminded her of her own daughter, who had died just before her 2nd birthday. The memory hit not like thunder, but like cold water. Sudden, drenching, undeniable, she fell to her knees. Not dramatically, just quietly. The noblewoman screamed. Servants rushed in. Someone tried to lift her, but she shook her head. Instead, she whispered, "Let her stay. She's only sleeping." There was no child beside her, but Augusta saw one. She felt one. The scene was cleaned quickly. The queen was escorted back to her quarters, The children were removed from the hall. No one spoke of it again. But from that day forward, the whispers changed. "She's not grieving," they said. "She's lost her senses." And in truth, they weren't wrong. But neither were they right. Because what Augusta was losing was not her mind. It was her place in the world. Grief had made her invisible. Madness made her unpalatable. She became a ghost, not just of the nursery, but of the palace itself. She wandered its halls with soft steps, trailing memories like silk scarves fallen from her sleeves. She attended court less, spoke only when spoken to, and when she did speak, her voice was gentler, as if afraid it might wake someone. At night, she took to sleeping with a small stuffed animal, a gift from one of her children long ago. She hid it under her pillow, not for comfort, but as a totem, proof that someone once had called her Mama. One evening, a servant reported hearing music. Soft, hesitant notes played on the clavichord. No one had touched the instrument in years. When they entered the room, Augusta was seated there, her back straight, her fingers hovering above the keys. She wasn't playing. She was remembering. "The sound used to help them sleep," she said. No one responded. What could they say? How do you speak to a woman who walks through life in the shadow of her own nursery? They told her on a gray afternoon. Frederick, Prince of Wales, heir to the British throne, her husband, the man she had served beside for nearly 2 decades, was dead. It wasn't dramatic. No sword, no scandal. Just a cough, then a fever, then silence. Pneumonia, the doctor said. Fluid in the lungs. He had ignored the signs, kept attending banquets, kept laughing, until his lungs drowned him from within. They sent a messenger to Augusta's quarters, carrying the words like a knife in a velvet sheath. "Your Royal Highness, the prince has passed." She did not gasp. She did not weep. She only asked, "At what hour?" Then she stood, walked to the window, and watched the rain fall as if trying to memorize the shape of loss. She had lost many things before: children, health, sleep. But this was different. Not because she loved him deeply. Frederick had been many things, but warm was not one of them, no. This loss was political, symbolic. With his death, she was no longer the Princess of Wales, not yet queen, not quite widow. She was trapped in a space between roles, too central to be forgotten, too expendable to be trusted. And then came the real cruelty. The court denied her full mourning rights. She would not wear the thick black veils of a royal widow. She would not lead the funeral procession. It would confuse the public, they said. You are not queen. They offered her gray, not black, not the color of real grief. Just a watered-down version of sorrow. But Augusta refused. She dressed in deepest black, not once, not twice, but for 5 years. Every dinner, every court appearance, every Sunday service. She wore grief like armor, like rebellion. If they wouldn't give her mourning, she would be mourning. She became a shadow among velvet and candlelight, a figure people bowed to, but avoided. She said little, smiled less, spoke only when necessary, and she kept her distance from her children. Because even in mourning, the palace had rules. George, her eldest, now stood at the center of everything. He was the heir. He was watched, controlled. She was told to step back, not to interfere with his education, not to visit him too often. Let him grow into a man, the advisors warned. Your influence must not soften him. So she obeyed. She watched from afar, and once again, she became the ghost of a role she once embodied. But grief, as always, does not come alone. It waits, and then it returns. Just as Augusta began to regain her breath, just as her black dresses became less heavy, another illness crept into the nursery. Her youngest daughter, Caroline, barely 4 years old, fell ill with smallpox. They tried everything: herbs, mercury, prayer. Nothing worked. Caroline died within days. Her skin had turned to ash, her eyes cloudy, her tiny hands no longer warm. Augusta was not permitted at her bedside. Infection risk, they said. So she stood behind the nursery door, listened to the coughing, and when it stopped, she knew. Another coffin, another cradle empty. The funeral was quick, modest. The court was weary of mourning, but Augusta was not. She wore a black veil that covered her entire face. Not out of formality, but because behind it, she allowed herself to weep. The tears were quiet, but real. The kind that leave trails behind the eyes. The kind that alter the shape of a voice. After Caroline's death, Augusta stopped playing music entirely. The clavichord in her chamber remained closed. Its ivory keys yellowed from disuse. She also stopped writing. Her journals, once filled with desperate prayers and whispered grief, were now blank. She no longer had the words, only silence. And silence, in her world, had become the only truth. She refused visitors, refused letters. She spoke on occasion to the portraits in the gallery, called them by names that belonged to children now buried, sat beside the fireplace, and whispered lullabies to no one. The palace began to whisper again. This time, they did not call her cold. They called her haunted. She wears her mourning like skin, one courtier said. I'm not sure she even remembers who she was before the coffins. But Augusta remembered. She remembered every name, every face, every fever, every cradle lowered into the ground. She remembered the first time she held each child, and the last time she touched them. And the difference between those moments was always shorter than it should have been. Now, with her husband gone, her youngest gone, and her eldest drifting into the hands of politicians, Augusta had nothing left to bury, except herself. She didn't die, not then, but a part of her folded inward, like a letter never sent, like a song never finished. And what remained was not a queen, not a princess, not even a mother, just a figure in black, pacing the palace halls, trailing the scent of lavender and dust. A living eulogy for a family that never got to grow old together. Augusta had buried her husband. She had buried her children. But what she did not realize, at least not at first, was that she was now expected to bury herself. Not literally, just politically. When Frederick died, the court moved fast, not to console Augusta, but to contain her. George, her eldest son, was now heir to the throne, and George was still only a boy, which meant Augusta, in theory, stood at the threshold of power. As mother to the future king, she might have become a queen in all but name, a regent, a guide, a force behind the curtain. But the men around her had other plans. They feared her grief. They feared her German blood. They feared the silence that clung to her like a veil. And most of all, they feared what she might do with that silence. So they built walls around her. Not stone, not brick, but rules, advisors, distance. They told her it was for the prince's benefit, that George needed to grow independently, to be raised in the English style, to be educated under the best minds of the realm. He must not be overly influenced by foreign softness, one minister said. Foreign, soft. She heard the words clearly. They were speaking of her. They removed her from his daily lessons. They restricted her visits. They screened her correspondence. At court functions, she was placed further from the king. At dinners, she was asked not to speak of politics. She was not banned. She was not exiled. She was politely erased. A presence with no gravity, a mother with no access. Augusta did not fight them, not directly. She had learned long ago that confrontation only gave her enemies sharper blades. Instead, she moved with calculation. She remained visible, dressed impeccably in black, her posture flawless, her silence heavy enough to fill rooms. She wrote to George, short letters, carefully worded, not of power, but of health, of manners, of memory. Remember to pray every evening. Your father would have wanted you to lead with dignity. I miss your voice. Sometimes he replied. Sometimes he didn't. She understood. He was a boy being shaped by hands she could no longer see. Hands that wanted to mold him into a weapon, not a son. But still, she tried. She sent him books from her private library. She planted trees in the garden with his name carved on small plaques. She whispered his name in prayers, even when no one was listening, perhaps especially then. But as years passed, so did proximity. The court changed. Ministers came and went. George grew into a man, and Augusta. She remained, not as a guide, not as a regent, but as a threat. They said she was too influential, that her opinions could sway votes, that her devotion to the old Protestant order might disrupt the carefully balanced factions of Parliament. And so they moved her subtly to Kew Palace. A royal residence, yes, but also a quiet one, far enough from Whitehall, far enough from her son, far enough from relevance. It wasn't a punishment, not officially. They called it retreat. They said she needed peace. They praised her resilience in public. But the message was clear. You have done your duty. Now disappear. At Kew, she received fewer visitors. Her letters were still monitored. Her role reduced to ceremonial gestures, attending births, baptisms, funerals. Always funerals. She became the permanent mourner of the dynasty, the black-clad backdrop to every chapter of royal life. And yet, she endured. Not out of stubbornness, but out of principle. She still kept portraits of her children, all of them, even the dead, even the forgotten. She spoke of them often, as if they had never left. At court, this was called eccentric. At Kew, it was her liturgy. One day, when asked by a court lady why she kept so many portraits of her late daughter, Augusta replied, "Because the court forgets, but I do not. And someone must remember the ones too small to be buried with legacy." She never wrote memoirs, never granted interviews, never defended herself. She let the silence speak for her. because in a palace that tried to erase her, silence had become her loudest weapon. And even in exile, she remained a mother, not in title, not in power, but in essence, in every breath, in every stitched hem of black fabric, in every paused sentence where a name used to be. She had lost her voice in court, but she still spoke, in the way her grief reshaped the air around her. And history, for all its noise, would not be able to ignore her forever. History, like grief, is never unanimous. For every monument built, 100 names are erased. And for every woman who lived behind palace walls, there are 1,000 versions of her, none entirely true, and none entirely false. So what became of Augusta of Saxe-Gotha in the eyes of those who survived her? That depended on who you asked, and what they needed her to be. To some, she was the cold mother, formal, rigid, overbearing. They pointed to her stern letters, her strict rules, her refusal to embrace the social warmth expected of royal women. They described her as controlling, especially over her son, George III, a mother who sought to shape a king from the shadows. She never smiled, one courtier recalled, even at weddings, even at births, as if joy had become unseemly. The historians who favored politics over emotion often painted Augusta in gray, a placeholder, a figurehead, a necessary participant in the machinery of monarchy, no more, no less. But others saw something different. Not a cold woman, but a wounded one. Not distant, but guarded. Not controlling, just clinging. Because when a woman has buried more children than she has dressed for their first ball, when her letters outlive her children's voices, when her lullabies fade long before her name becomes irrelevant, she builds walls. Not to trap others, but to stop herself from bleeding out. The women who served her at Kew, long after the royal spotlight faded, described a quieter Augusta. A woman who walked her garden in the morning mist, always alone. A woman who still laid out toys in her private rooms, not for living grandchildren, but for those who never grew. A woman who prayed not for victory, but for reunion. One maid said, "She never asked for pity, but once, when she saw me crying over a bird I buried in the garden, she said, 'You've already learned more than most kings ever do.'" Some modern scholars would later refer to her as the ghost matriarch, a maternal figure who haunted British royalty long after her death. Her son, King George III, rarely spoke of her in public. But in private, he ordered her portraits kept. He preserved her letters. And when he lost his own child, the first of many, he was said to have whispered, "Now I understand her silence." Others weren't so generous. In political discourse, especially during George III's reign and eventual mental decline, Augusta became a target. Pamphlets mocked her as the German spider, spinning webs of influence, trapping English sons in maternal guilt. Caricatures showed her holding marionette strings, guiding her son like a puppet. Her eyes always shaded, her mouth sewn shut, her hands clenched tight over her own heart. Even in satire, they could not imagine her letting go. But what no pamphlet captured, and no painting dared depict, was the quietest truth of all. That Augusta's greatest ambition was never power. It was preservation, of memory, of names, of a family history soaked not in glory, but in loss. She never built a palace. She never commanded an army. She never sat on a throne. But she remembered each birth, each fever, each coffin, each name. And in remembering, she resisted oblivion. Because that is what grief does when you carry it long enough. It becomes religion, not a loud one, not a church with bells, but a private altar in a woman's mind, lit with the candles of names no one says aloud anymore. Her journals, those that survived, read like scripture, not of God, but of mourning. They say I linger too long in sorrow, but what else is left when joy does not linger for me? My son speaks with confidence now. I hear my words in his voice. May they not become knives in his mouth. I do not wish to be remembered, only not to be misunderstood. And that final line, that plea not for fame, but for clarity, would echo centuries later, because Augusta was not a villain, nor a saint. She was something harder to define. A mother who lived too long past her children, a woman who endured her own disappearance. Not many would have survived what she did, and perhaps fewer still would have survived becoming what she had to be. A figurehead of grief, a statue that no sculptor wanted to chisel, but that history left standing anyway. Because in the end, even history could not decide. Was she a stranger to the English court, or a saint among the forgotten? The answer, like grief itself, remains incomplete. Augusta never posed for a grand state portrait after her husband's death. There would be no oil painting of her in regalia, no frozen image of her holding a scepter, no dramatic canvas proclaiming her lineage, her power, or her triumphs. No. The last portrait of Augusta, the one that survives in archives and quiet galleries, is something entirely different. She sits in a modest chair, back straight, hands folded in her lap. No crown, no velvet. Only a simple black dress, the same she had worn for years. Behind her, a heavy curtain. To her left, the edge of a clavichord, unplayed. Her expression is unreadable, not stern, not gentle, but still, as if someone had asked her to smile, and she had simply declined. The painter had asked if she wanted any objects placed in the scene, a family ring, a religious token, a miniature of her son the king. Augusta refused, but she did request one item, barely visible in the final canvas. A folded white bonnet placed on the corner of the clavichord. The same bonnet her infant son had worn before he died. No one commented on it. The artist left it in, half in shadow, easily missed by the casual viewer. But Augusta never looked away from it. That portrait was never displayed publicly during her lifetime. It hung in a back hallway of Kew Palace, beside landscapes and forgotten still lifes. Visitors rarely saw it. Servants dusted it with respectful silence. And when Augusta died, they nearly removed it. Too plain, said one court official. Too sad. But someone, no record shows who, insisted it stay. It is the truest image of her, they wrote. Let her remain as she was, unadorned, uncelebrated, unforgettable. Augusta died in 1772 at the age of 52. Not old, but not young either. No fanfare marked her passing. The nation did not mourn deeply. By then, George III was king in full. The court had moved on. The people remembered her, if at all, as the serious German widow. She was buried at Westminster Abbey, a place for monarchs, for memory. But her grave was plain. No sculpture, no elaborate tomb, Just a stone with her name, her titles, and a date. No mention of the children she bore. No line about the children she lost. No inscription that whispered of music or lullabies or loss. Just Augusta, Princess of Wales, consort to Frederick, mother to King George III. The rest, it seems, was left to dust. And yet, her presence never quite vanished. Visitors to Kew Palace sometimes spoke of a heaviness in the halls. A silence that lingered too long in the nursery. A piano key that pressed itself down when no one touched it. A faint scent of lavender and wax. Folklore? Perhaps. But history, too, has its ghosts. And Augusta was one of them. In family records, she appears as a footnote. In official documents, a transition. But in the margins, in the diaries, the nursemaid's notes, the scattered letters, her outline returns. A mother who kept mourning. A woman who chose silence not because she had nothing to say, but because no one truly listened. That final portrait was eventually moved. Not to a throne room, not to a national gallery, but to a small corner of the royal collection. Hung near a child's watercolor, across from an unfinished painting of a crib. It still hangs there today, unremarkable at first glance, until you see the bonnet, until you notice the clavichord, until you realize this is not a portrait of a princess. It is a portrait of grief. The kind of grief that refuses to fade, not because it is loud, but because it knows how to wait. Wait in the corners of rooms, wait behind closed nursery doors, wait in the pages that no one reads, until someone someday finally wonders, who was she? Not just as consort, not just as mother to a king, but as Augusta, the woman who buried her children and was never buried properly in memory. There are women in history who move mountains, raise kingdoms, command armies. And then there are women who are tasked with surviving. Not wars, but funerals. Not betrayal, but silence. Not exile, but erasure. Augusta of Saxe-Gotha was not remembered for her brilliance or her beauty or her battles. She was remembered, if at all, for her proximity to power, for being the wife of a prince who never became king, the mother of a king who outgrew her, the occupant of a palace that gradually emptied around her. But that is not the truth, not the real one, because Augusta's reign was not over subjects. It was over shadows. She ruled grief. She governed memory. She preserved the names the kingdom forgot to write down. In a world where women were valued for the children they could bear, she lived long enough to bury most of them. And in doing so, she became something the monarchy feared most: a mirror. Not a mirror of glory, but of cost. She was the cost of lineage, of empire, of legacy. She wore that cost in black, wore it when the bells stopped ringing, when the nurseries were silent, when the portraits were taken down. And still, she stood, not in defiance, not in triumph, but in a posture so steady, so quiet, it became unshakable. We often mistake quietness for absence. We assume that if someone does not scream, they are not in pain. If they do not protest, they do not resist. If they do not speak, they must have nothing to say. But Augusta challenges that assumption. She teaches us that grief, true grief, is not a spectacle. It is a companion. That some people do not want to be remembered loudly. They want to be remembered correctly. She is not a tragic heroine. She is not a political martyr. She is not a legend. She is something far more human. She is the echo of every mother who outlived her child. The breath that catches when a memory surfaces unexpectedly. The shadow that lingers in places where love once lived. And if we are wise, we will not pity her. We will not reduce her to her black dresses and her silences. We will see her for what she truly was. A woman who bore the weight of dynasties and still reached out to cradle absence with both hands. In the end, Augusta left behind no monuments. But maybe grief does not need marble. Maybe all it needs is someone, somewhere to remember. Not the titles, not the crown, but the woman, the mother, the ghost in the nursery who never stopped whispering their names.